the original impulse which generated new tendencies in the creative fields as well as in man's nature and goals pertaining to changing response to life. But it is a natural phenomena that one can neither wish to isolate nor escape from the human experience for long. Poets like Dorothy Livesey and E.J. Pratt grew anxious to cultivate a new poetic style which could capture the new substance of life and at the same time make a direct appeal to its readers. The poetry is man centered psychologically and intellectually, like the role of nature, the significance of poetic devices like imagery and symbol is also redefined. Though the earliest Canadian anthology of any importance was E. H. Dewart's selection from Canadian poets, which was published in 1864, it is A. J. M. Smith's The Book of Canadian Poetry, which appeared in 1943, that presented the changes of taste and quality in poetry written between 1948 and 1957. Now, to understand Canadian poetry of the mid 20th century, one of the fundamental approaches is to look at a historical and insightful critical process which A.J.M. Smith and E.K. Brown encouraged. It held in two ways. It established a canon of Canadian poetry and assessed the achievements of individual poets, and it opened up vistas for endless possibilities of having Canadian criticism with its own traditions and vision of Canadian poetry, which means a poetry appropriate to Canadian experience, to use the words of George Woodcock. Now, if the poetry of early decades,
You have joined the call. There are three other people in Windows.
if
Goldie, your microphone is on.
if the poetry of early decades, that is of Charles Sangster, E.J. Pratt, and Archibald Lampman, Charles G. Roberts, D.C. Scott, Isabella Valency Crawford, makes a very special use of the Canadian scene and the world of nature. The poetry of the later decades has added a peculiar quality of emanacism, which is visual and it translates the landscape into words. Various traditions of early English poetry, like that of T.E. Hulme or English Jacobins, and even Jewish tradition commingled and created extraordinary effects, as in the poetry of A. M. Klein. There exists in Canadian poetry a new sense of sharing the vision or voices at the global level without losing the intensity of the personal vision about the immediate world. Another characteristic quality of Canadian poetry is that it attempts to assimilate and at the same time rebel against the conventional poetics, an effort that gave Canadian poets an idiom that perfectly suited their private visions as well as the moods of the period. That does not mean that they were a homogeneous group. On the contrary, they were distinctly different voices, interlocked groups who shared the common predicament, a common cause of promoting cultural nationalism through poetry. In an attempt to find their own voices self consciously, they happen to discover their collective national identity through poetry. Briefly, the poets realized that if they gave expressions to the experiences they knew within their own place and time, they may emerge as distinctively Canadian poets. The social conversational rhythm and sharp visual images add a new dimension to their poetry. For illustration, let's take the work of Dorothy Livesey, whose intense feminism and personal experiences, combined with political concerns, make her a truly liberated, vigorous poet. Similarly, in P.K. Page's poetry, there is remarkable verbal economy and intensity. Poets like Irving Layton, Miriam Worthington, and Margaret Evison reveal a world of perception rich in perplexities of faith and doubt. Now, the 20th century's first half, that is from 1900 to 1950, serves as a context for the second half. Now, in this half, the Romantic and the Victorian heritage dominated the scene. Yes, Malshi, tell me.
Ma'am, I can attend these classes now. Like this MEG-12 is currently not in this year, but it might be in the next year, I'm thinking.
Yeah, why not? I think, though, no issue, but if we can just get confirmed one more time, but why not? You're going to study it in the next year, right?
Yes, ma'am. Currently there are only four subjects,
Hmm.
but as I saw the schedule, so the subjects are going to start from around 25th of September.
Okay,
So
your
before this,
subjects.
these yes, ma'am, subjects that are being allotted in this year,
Hmm.
and next year I do not know which subjects will be allotted, so
Okay.
I'm attending. So no issues, ma'am.
I
I'm
don't think
as
as long as you are
yeah.
interested for getting knowledge and learning something new, absolutely no
Yes,
problem.
ma'am, sure.
But then regarding this particular protocol, I think regional college Bhubaneswar would be the best place to guide you on that.
Okay, ma'am.
From
Sure,
where the
ma'am.
classroom is getting conducted, yeah, you can have a talk with them.
Okay, ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
Can we move ahead?
Yes, ma'am. Surely, ma'am.
Okay. Okay. So, yes, so we were talking about the 20th century's first half, which includes 1900 to 1950. And in this half, the Romantic and the Victorian heritage dominated the scene. Now, there was also a phase of neo colonial modernism. Among these traditional figures was E.J. Pratt. Then come the followers of Anglo-American free versists and imagists. Here, W.W.E. Ross was a notable figure. Then came the Montreal Group. Then came the First Statement, which was an influential magazine in the 40s. John Sutherland, Irving Layton, and Louis Dudek figured here. Dudek's poem of urban experience are especially very important. Early Burney and Raymond Soster are important figures in the 40s. Next, we come to the contemporary poetry and its characteristics. Now, Canadian poetry, they show an extraordinary continuity throughout the 20th century. If some poets of the early decades have a feeble voice, others like A.J.M. Smith and E.J. Pratt assured the flow of vital current. The unbroken continuity and brilliance of Canadian poetry was sustained by Earl Burnley, Dorothy Livesey, P.K. Page, Irving Layton, and others who first began in the 1930s and 1940s but produced their best known works in 1960s and 1970s. The striking characteristics of the later part of the 20th century Canadian poetry has a remarkable poetry upsurge which carried many trends of the modernist movement, including its tendency to be self consciously anti popular, as George Woodbuck put it. An extraordinary outburst of poetry, yielding amazing results between 1960 and 1973. Not less than 590 poets published over 100 books of verse, leave aside the works which appeared in the anthologies and the magazines. Thus, poetry in Canada became the most significant form of artistic activity, the fashionable movement, society, and poets became cultural heroes. Canadian poetry, being preoccupied with the happenings of the time, its culture and counterculture, showed a deep involvement with the Canadian national identity, which should not be mistaken for the political issues. Liberation from the traditional colonial goals also led to visualizing the realities of Canadian experiences. Another result of these changes made poetry enjoy an unprecedented status in 1980, and it attained an international repute because, as Fire put it, such a quantitative increase eventually makes for a qualitative change. It actually happened. If poets like Al Prudi wrote directly from their own experience, so much so his poems read like pages from his autobiography, displaying a wide range of his moods. The Marxist Leninist politics influenced poets like Milton Akan and Parik Lane. Northrop Pyre's critical theories promoted the use of mythology and new myths, as in James Rennie, J. Macpherson, Phyllis Webb, and Ellie Mendel's poetry. There is a keen sense of locality, as in Robert Croix. All that happened to the land and its people shaped the worldview of the poets. To translate their ideas and vision of life, they innovated myths, symbols, and images, overinterpreted the old ones. Nicole, among other innovatory poets, succeeded in creating resemblance between the content and the form of a poem. He says the poem begins and ends nowhere, being part of the flow you live with. Nicole is a true surrealist poet of Canada, while Michael Ondaatje makes his poetry out of the absurd representation of actuality. George Boring and Daphne Marlett are deeply influenced by Charles Olson's theories of projectivist verse, which consider poetry to be a structure of syllabus and breadth. There are poets who are so individualistic that they prefer to choose their own manner and style, mingling the traditions with innovations. For instance, take Leonard Cohen and Gwendolen McEwen. As many critics aptly observe, Canadian poets like New Love achieve their brilliance being romantic in temperament but diverse in their approaches and style. They create harmonious verse structures to convey their emotional diversities, which grew out of a compelling intermediary world of magic and dream. If Dennis Lee rejects Canadian society because of its prevailing ills and becomes a political poet, Otwood, being an experimental poet, is fastidious in form and psychological, historical in thought. Canadian poetry tends to believe in William James' notion that reality keeps changing. It grows out of Canada's pluralistic society, mosaic culture, and enduring domestic values in the face of hostile nature. It adheres to an authentic indigenous system in the face of mobile appearances, of multiple realities, of here and now. In this famous essay, The Canadian Imagination, David Stock has succinctly observed that at the center of every imaginative response, buried however deeply, is a vision of human existence. But Canadian imagination is different, as it is obsessed with the limitations rather than the possibilities of human existence. It happens to be so for two specific reasons. Survival rather than freedom is a great fact of Canadian life, and holding on to what is known or safe, that is to preserve the values, however humble they may be, is at its center. If the former lends Canadian poetry the image of bleak landscape, which is turbulent and destructive, the latter gives its image of small and humble adobe, which no doubt promise or domestic security. Consequently, the Canadian poets have the capacity to sing, to feel, to save it on the one hand called as intellectualism and on the other from sheer inauthenticity. Louis Dudek sums up the characteristics of Canadian poetry, stating that Canadian poetry is written out of inner necessity and is a proof rather than of a predicament than a solution of the great questions in his mind or any other time. In the 20th century, there is a general shift from mere consciousness of a past to what is valuable in the present. Besides, the contemporary poets attempt to be mythical as poetry offers them possibilities to be new by making them take an excursion into the world of ideas. There is an attempt to create such poems in which ideas and arrangement of words on the page are meant to show a tendency to present and preserve the essence of the new world in which the physical is endowed with the spiritual substance. Hence, the Canadian poets who are overpowered by the fear of the unknown world and are haunted by the loneliness chisel out their experiences into the bone essential statements. They share a curious kind of cultural anxiety. Later, Canadian poetry in general and nature poetry in particular show a change in attitude that is of mutualness, and it had added three important characteristics to Canadian nature poetry. The characteristics are it shows a clear sighted view of man's relationship to nature and animals, leading to an all pervading sense of mythic and historic unity with mankind. To borrow the expression of Woodcock, there is a haunting sense of love for nation. This is the second characteristics in the best form of nationalistic sentiments. For example, take the poem of Milton Acron, where he is carried away by the love for land and states that Canada is the state scent of pines, or Mackhaven's poem, which reveals her complete identification with her country. So much so, our hardly knows which is your body, which is the land. It's all one. And the third characteristics. There exists a direct knowledge of life gained through shrewd observations, which makes poets like Alden Nolan Patrick Lane and Robert Crush take a vow not to sing other than our lives. These poets have such a strong sense of locality that they are called the urban regionalists or the localists. Three important changes that have occurred over the decades in the contemporary Canadian poetry are language of the poems, which is the essential natural speech of the living people. The identity and occupations of the poets themselves have changed. They don't have to belong to some form of intellectual aristocracy. Whosoever happens to write good poems is a poet, as A.W. Purdy put it in his anthology entitled 15 Winds. The aim and intent of Canadian poetry itself has changed. Today, poetry talks about world as well as of the things that are timeless like love, death and birth. Whatever may be the topic, human emotions have reference to all things contained in human world. Whether a doorknob or a kitchen faucet, the interrelationships of human emotions are something else. Many of those are still a mystery. As Purdy asserts, the main trends briefly are search for roots, interaction between mindscape and landscape, a look inward for interior landscapes, the personal becoming, political and apolitical becoming personal, nationalistic concerns, native concerns, and poetry by women, the fate of selfhood, the need for personal mythologies, the life in the prairies, landscape as a menacing presence, and the sense of wilderness all form of part of thematic strands in recent Canadian poetry. Now, if you go by the individual directions taken by the work of poets, then in the 60s and the 70s, the major talents are Alprudi, Margaret Atwood, George Boring, and Michael Ondaatje, and Robert Crouch. As for early Burney, his book David and Other Poems is important. Among individual poems, Vancouver and November Walk near Falls Creek Mouth are important. Alprudi's Caribou Horses is significant too. There is also Ellie Mandel. Then there is Dennis Lee's Civil Elegies, which is a complex elegiac meditation on contemporary North American politics. The work of the Tisch Group is very significant. Frank Dave and George Bowring were significant poets around this time. Then there is Robert Crush, who gave us Stone Harner poem, The Ledger, and Field Notes. The last one contains Seed Catalogue, one of the best groups of the poems in recent Canadian poetry. Her Stevenson is based on an history of the town of Stevenson in British Columbia. Atwood, Ontague, and Crush are three novelists poets whose poetry has made a great impact. The first two figure in a subsequent unit, but their quintessential achievement in general can be touched upon here. The fourth important novelist poet is the native writer Thomas King, one of whose poems is included in Unit 8 of his blog. Now, in Ondaatje's case, three books came in quick succession. The first was The Dainty Monsters, the second was The Man with Seven Toes. The latter tells the story of an escaped convict and his female hostage in the interior of Australia. Then came the collected works of Billy the Kid. It mixes poetry and prose, dramatic monologue, and quick shifts of narrative perspective. The story is at once a meditation on the relationship between violence and creativity and an adventure. It is also a recreation of a popular hero. In 1979 came There's a Trick with a Knife I'm Learning to Do. Cross Seed Catalog, as was stated earlier, is a remarkable collection also. Here, prairies are seen as the region whose cultural growth is linked with the fertility myth of seeding, fruition, decay, and renewal. This is extremely representative, long poem. Section 4 of this poem are It arrived in winter, the seed catalogue on a January day. It came into town on the afternoon rain. Mary Hawk, when she came west from Bruce County, Ontario, arrived in town on a January day. She brought along her hope chest. She was cooking in the Hessler Hotel. The Hessler Hotel burned down on the night of June 21, 1919. Everything in between lost. Everything. An absence of satin sheets, of embroidered pillowcases, of tea towels and English china, of silver serving spoons. A little later in the same section, Cross catalogues various kinds of absences. It goes like this: the absence of silkworms, the absence of clay and bottles, the absence of Lord Nelson, the absence of kings and queens, the absence of a bottle opener and me with a vicious attack, of the 26-ounce flu, the absence of both Sartre and Heidegger, the absence of pyramids, absence of lions, the absence of lutes, violas, and xylophones, the absence of condom dispenser in Lethbridge Hotel, and me about to screw an old blood whore I was in love. The absence of the Parthenon, not to mention the Cathedral de Chartres, the absence of psychiatrists, the absence of selling ships, the absence of books, journals, daily newspapers, and everything else but the free press prairie farmer and the western producer, the absence of gallows, the absence of goldsmiths, the absence of the girl who said that if the Edmonton Eskimos won the Grey Cup, she would let me kiss her nipples in the foyer of the Palliser Hotel. I don't know where she got to. The absence of Heraclitus, the absence of Seine, the Rhine, the Danube, the Tiber, the Thames. Shit, the battle river can dry. One fall, the Strauss boy could piss across it. He could piss higher on a barn wall than any of us. He could piss right clean across the principal's new car. The absence of ballet and opera, the absence of ADs. Now, this kind of cataloging goes well both with modernism and postmodernism. So, we can say that the strength of Crosh poetry comes from its hardcore of details of encyclopedic range. At the level of single poem sequences, Crotch poem called Stone Hammer is really remarkable. Its first two sections read: the stone become a hammer of stone. The small is the color of bone. No bone is the color of the stone maul. The roved loops are gone. The hand is gone. The buffalo's skull is gone. The stone is shaped like the skull of a child. This paperweight on my desk, where I begin this poem, was found in a wheat field, lost. This hammer, this poem, cut to a function, the stone was, the hand is gone. When it comes to the overall poetic achievements of some of the other poets, a single poem from each of whom has been included for analysis is in the last unit, and now we move to the Canadian long poem. Canada's most distinctive achievement in recent times has been in the domain of the genre known as the contemporary long poem. Now, we discuss here about two or three major critics and their view on this genre. In the 1980s, the form most favored by Canadian poets has been the long poem. One can say that the E.J. Spratt's Towards the Last Pike, written in 1952, set the trend in modern times. Then there was Dennis Lee's Civil Elegies, 1968. In the mid 1960s, the strain was reinforced by the personal narrative poems of Earl Burney, Al Prudy, and others. In the former cases, Never Falls Greek Mouth, 1964, is a fine poem. In the consequence, just named November Walk near Falls Greek Mouth, the poet begins with a long walk along Vancouver's English Bay. Then it comes to a meditation on life, death, evolution, etc. The despair comes through in the reference to the unreached, unreachable nothing whose winds wash down to the human shores and slips showing. Alfredi's most remarkable long poem is the Caribou Horses. In the 1980, Phyllis Webb's letter to Margaret Atwood is significant, and so is Marlad's work in the long poem genre. An extreme remarkable work is George Baring's Kerrisdale Elegies. Kerrisdale is the name of Bowring, Vancouver's neighborhood. Rilke is a presence in Bowring text. A background text is Nichols' The Martyrology. The treatment of a problematic self keeps both the poems going. Nicole works with layers of genres like chronicle, genealogy, liturgy, epigraph, journal, etc. Excuse me. One of the best books of Canadian long poem is Smarro Cambourli's 1991 On the Edge of the Genre, the contemporary Canadian long poem. In her preface to book Cambourli, a number of critics such as Ellie Mandel, Frank Davey, Robert Grosh, excuse me, Michael Bernstein, and Joseph Riddle, to mention only a few, have already addressed the difficulty of describing the long poem from a generic point of view. What I have attempted to do here is to show that it is precisely this difficulty, this resistance to generic definition, that characterizes the long poem as a new genre. At the same time that it tempts us with a lyric, epic, or documentary reading, it breaks free from their specifications. It lies within and beyond the grammar of the various genres it includes. The law of the long poem as a new genre is its lawlessness. Its ungrammatically results in the thematization of its formal elements and its treatment as formal elements of major themes, namely locality, the self, and the idea of discourse. The series of reversals is accomplished in the present tense, a marker of the Long's poem desire to reside on the edge of things within the limits of genres, between the reflexibility of its language and the referentiality of its ideology. The long poem then makes itself felt through its discontinuities, its absences, and its deferrals by foregrounding both its writing process and our reading act. While it is interested in the materiality of language, it is also concerned with the unreadability of words, textuality. We now move to Unit 6 under Block 2, recent Commonwealth poetry and Canada's place in it. Now, why we study this Unit 6, recent Commonwealth poetry and Canada's place in it, is because it is so essential to introduce you to the quintessential achievement of recent Commonwealth poetry through some of its major figures. This will help to put in slightly better perspective the overall Canadian poetic achievement in recent years. We'll start first with Derek Walcott. Derek Walcott was born in 1930. He was the winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1992. He is a Caribbean poet from the island of St. Lucia. He does a lot of teaching and is quite mobile. The major influences on him are the American poet Robert Lowell and the Irish poet Seamus Heaney. Some of his works are Dream on Monkey Mountain, O Babylon, Viva Detroit, In a Green Night poems, The Castaway, The Gulf, Another Light, Omeros, The Fortunate Traveler. Walcott founded the Trinidad Theatre Workshop in 1959, where many of his own plays, among others, were first performed. His theatre mingles prose and verse, Creole's vocabulary, and calypso rhythms, and it is often preoccupied with national identity, with the choice of home or exile, self realization, or spiritual betrayal of one's country. Walcott's poetry is deeply concerned with the conflict between the heritage of European and West Indian culture. Walcott's most formidable poem is Omiris, written in 1990, where he imaginatively uses the Homeric narratives as the basis of a modernist long poem. Widespread recognition came with In a Green Night poems, The Castaway, The Gulf, Another Life, ironic, antithetical poetry of personal and artistic discovery, detached and skeptical poetry, simultaneously religious in drift, has followed in Sea Grapes, written in 1976. One major theme of Walcott's writing is the dichotomy between black and white, subject and ruler, and the elements of both Caribbean and Western civilization present in his culture and ancestry. One well known poem, A Far Cry from Africa, from In a Green Night, Poems 1948 to 60, deals directly with Walcott's sense of cultural confusion. Where shall I turn, divided to the vein? I who have cursed the drunken officer of British rule, how choose between this Africa and the English tongue I love, betray them both, or give back what they give? In another poem, The Schooner Fight from his collection, The Star Apple Kingdom, the poet uses a Trinidadian sailor named Shabine to appraise his own place as a person of mixed blood in a world divided into whites and blacks. According to the mariner, the first chain my hands and apologize history. The next said I wasn't black enough for their pride. Not white enough for whites, not black enough for the blacks. Shabine sums up the complexity of his situation near the beginning of the poem, saying, I had a sound colonial education. I have Dutch, nigger, and English in me, and either I am nobody or I am a nation. The poems in the Bounty addressed many of Walcott's chief concerns, including the problems of language colonialism and history, but a more pronounced fixation on aging, death, and loss emerges as well. Critics have praised Walcott for his mastery of language and poetic technique. Images keep recurring, crisscrossing, gaining new associations in verses than have the noble radiance of stained glass, grave but full of light. In other poems, such as The Spoiler's Return, he explores more direct and orthodox forms, but also in a technique used by many other writers, gives standard English a distinctive note by the subtle intrusion of a Caribbean lexicon, syntax, and rhythm. Walcott's short poems, Tomorrow Tomorrow, is interesting. He's also written wonderful collection called Midsummer, poem 26 under Midsummer. They are all remarkable for their dense texture, complex and contemporaneous imagery, for the depths of its versification. We now move to the next poet, that is Seamus Heaney. Seamus Heaney won the 1995 Nobel Prize for Literature and was born in 1939 in North Ireland. In 1970, he moved to Republic of Ireland. He has done extensive teaching and has written on other poets. One of his books on prose is The Government of the Tongue, Station Island, which is the remarkable volume of the poems. Other works are 11 poems written in 1965, Death of Naturalist 1966, Door in the Dark 1969, The Hall Lantern 1987. Heaney's main strength is the imaginative richness and the intellectual depth of his rendering of the Ireland of the 60s through the 90s. He has remarkable depth of feeling about both geographical terrain and human suffering. W. H. Auden is an influence on him, and so is Robert Lowell. Parts of Heaney's remarkable poem Bogland read, "We have no prairies to slice a big sun at evening. Everywhere the sun concedes to encroaching horizon." The geographical sense of our land comes through unmistakably in the poem. Another poem, From the Frontier of Writing, gives a sense of the civil conflict in Northern Ireland, the tightness and the leanness around that space where the car stops in the road, the troops inspect its make and number, and one bends his face. The menace that lurks in North Ireland's conflict is strongly present in this poem. It comes through in telling images, which also are remarkable for their complexities. We next move to A.K. Ramanujan, who is an Indian poet, and we talk about him in a bit. We also talk about some other poets. A.K. Ramanujan, who was born in Mysore, India, died in the United States, where he was a university professor. He was a remarkable linguist and translator too. He writes about living and writing between two cultures. His poems are highly particular and often personal, but what comes through strongly is a sense of relationship of self to one's body and to history, to his traditional Hindu upbringing, and to his modern American environment. His poem, Pleasure, reads, "A naked Jaina monk, ravaged by spring, fever the vigor of long celibacy, lusting now as never before for the reek insight, by its own saliva cool Ganges, turning sensual on him." This poem is full of sensuous particularity, and Ramanujan's range of themes and styles is breathtaking. His images are very lively, and there is in her poetry a sense of rootedness. This often exists in tension with an anxious sense of cultural displacement. Most of the time, Ramanujan work straddles the two worlds of his Indian and American experiences. There is one more poet, Les Murray, born in 1938, and he is a powerful Australian poet. The Powerline Incantation and An Absolutely Ordinary Rainbow typify his adventurous and commanding poetry. Noonday Examen epitomizes his role as sage and as a mythologizer of Australian landscape and culture. Most of his write ups, like the Ilex Tree, the Weatherboard Cathedral, Poems Against Economics, Lunch and Counter Lunch, Ethnic Radio, Daylight Moon, Dog Fox Field, A Boy Who Stole the Funeral, all make up for that life with his virtuosity and caving.
And Bobby, your microphone.
Ma'am, you fix your speaker properly.
Is my speaker not
Your
properly
speech tabs
fixed?
are visible. Use
I
Windows
think
switcher to
little
open.
bit resound is coming.
Okay. Is it okay now? Is it audible?
Yeah, yeah,
Is it fine?
yeah. It's fine.
Okay. To conclude with this part, the point of these brief references to these non Canadian English language poets is that there is a lot that Canadian and non Canadian Commonwealth English language poetry have to offer each other. But if the poets treated here are more cosmopolitan, the Canadians are better with a long poem. Canadians should not shut themselves off from Anglo American and Commonwealth poetry in English. In the same way, a greater reliance on modernists' methods and less of a distrust of Yeats, Eliot, Endane, and Lowell as influences is capable of being helpful in the long run. The long poem is the main strength of Canadian poetry as a whole, but shorter poems in metaphysical strain should also find greater representation in Canadian literary output. In the fields of poems by women writers, Canada is quite well placed and has a lot of things to offer to other English language Commonwealth poets. Poetry by expatriate women also is a strong body of writing in Canada. On the whole, Canadian poetry compares quite favorably with poetry from other Commonwealth countries. Voices from the margins are also being accommodated quite well these days. Some of the questions that you might take down for this particular unit is Walcott's poetry, which is very important. What makes Walcott's poetry a little more complex and hybridized than the poetry of most Canadian poets? How does Heaney show an acute awareness of the political situation in Northern Ireland? What is the distinctive style about A.K. Ramanujan? So these are some of the poets you have to keep in mind, and you have to read about the styles, their thematic explorations, and what exactly they would want to convey through their poems. We move to the next unit. This is two major novelists as poets, two major novelists who turned themselves to be poets. This is under Unit 7. Here we shall concentrate on two major novelist poets, Margaret Atwood and Michael Ondaatje. We shall take up two poems. One is a Sibyl, which is written by Atwood, and Letters and Other Worlds by Ondaatje. From there, we shall generalize about their respective poetic contributions. We shall brief uh, about their lives as well. So let's start first with Sibyl, written by Atwood, Margaret Atwood. Margaret Atwood, as a poet of Sibyl, was born in Ottawa on November 18th, 1939. Atwood is one of the Canada's best known writers. She is the author of a number of novels, also of which Surfacing is one of the better known ones. Recently, she won the Booker's Prize for her novel, The Blind Assassin. She studied in Victoria George College, University of Toronto, and her master's degree from Harvard. Starting with the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, Canada in 1964, she has taught at many places. She later became a full-time writer. Atwood is as good a poet as is a writer for novels. Her books of poetry include The Animals in That Country, 1968, Procedures from Underground, 1970, Power Politics, 1971, Two Headed Poems, 1978, and a few others. Selected poems appeared in 1976. She has edited the Oxford Book of Canadian Poetry. Her well known novel is Surfacing. She writes in a stark style. The point of view is often that of an alienated individual. There is often a disturbance of the everyday's world. She finds it a place of deceptive appearances. The remarkable thing about her poetry is the power of her imagery and the vivid precision of her language. Some short poems offer very good examples of it. Her lyrics are short and laconic, and on them she provides sharp insights in the consciousness of the speaker. In her longer poems, which are often series of connected poems, she develops symbolic and visionary explanations of the ironic dualities of existence. A Sibyl by Margaret Atwood. There are 5 verses, paragraphs, and it reads like this. Below my window in the darkening backyard, the children play at war. On my shelves, the bottles accumulate. My Sibyl, every woman should have one, has chosen to live there. Thin green wine bottles emptied of small dinners, Ovaltine jars, orange brown emptied of easy sleep. Yes, Malshri, you were saying something?
Yes, ma'am. What is the meaning of Sibyl
Yes,
here?
yes. So Sibyl is particularly, if you can understand that, according to Margaret Atwood, that every woman should carry a Sibyl. Okay, so if you understand it in deeper way, what does she wants to say? It's a kind of what you can call um, a kind of a
Is
prophet.
it aura
Is it a
or
kind?
strength?
It's a kind of a feeling that a female can easily receive, the kind of a vibe that she can easily receive from the other end. Generally, Sibyl is considered to be one kind of mythological bent of a quality which a female prophet or a witch generally carries. So, if you are extremely entangled with the consciousness, you are able to understand what is coming from the other side. So that is
Okay,
what
ma'am.
Sibyl, yes, Sibyl means. So basically, it's a very authentic kind of a quality which rarely people have. But if they have, they are
Okay,
actually
ma'am.
blessed.
Okay, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
ma'am.
Okay.
Thank you, ma'am.
Fine. So yes, uh, my Sibyl has chosen to live there. Thin green wine bottles emptied of small dinners, Ovaltine jars, orange brown emptied of easy sleep. My Sibyl crouches in one of them, wrinkled as a pickled baby, two-headed prodigy, at a freak fair, hairless, her sightless eyes like egg whites. Over the fading city, she calls to me with the many voices of the children. Not I want to die, but you must die. Later or sooner, alas, you were born, weren't you? The minutes thunder like guns, coupling won't help you. Or plurality. I see it, I prophesy. So, in the first 2 verse paragraphs, the speaker gives the location of her Sibyl, and if you would want to delve a bit more deep into exactly what Margaret wants to convince, you would understand that she is talking more about a kind of a classical antiquity, a classical prophetic figure who often depict, who can often predict the future. And in literature, this particular term, Sibyl, is used to refer as a particular kind of an authentic quality who only is possessed by a wise woman. who possess a knowledge of fate and destiny, somebody who can make prophecy, who can predict. Now, in this particular example, the concept of Sibyl can be interpreted in various different ways depending on the themes that she would want to explore. Atwood here often delves into the themes like power, control, and fate, with a focus on women's roles in society. Now, it plays a kind of a mythological and historical reference here. So, in the first two verse paragraphs, the speaker gives the location of her Sibyl. The location is in one of the bottles on the shelves in her house. Below the speaker's window, on the darkening background, children play at watering the flower beds. She adds parenthetically that every woman should have one Sibyl. On the shelves are thin green wine bottles emptied of small dinners, and there are also Ovaltine jars of orange brown color that have been emptied of easy sleep. In one of them is the poet Sibyl. The speaker starts looking over the fading city, and the Sibyl calls to her with the many voices of the children. She reminds her of the inevitability of death. She tells the poetess that coupling won't help her anymore. Now, time passes, and the poet talks of her present predicament. The Sibyl does not reach the poetess. The poetess calls the Sibyl Old Spider Sibyl and tells her that she would either uncork her to let in a little air so she would ignore her. Now, artwards, a Sibyl a poem particularly, revisits the classical myths from a feminist perspective. So, this is where she is talking about the women's struggle and foresight in dystopian settings. We move to Michael Ondaatje as poet, letters, and other worlds. Michael Ondaatje was born in Sri Lanka in 1943. He studied in England and then moved to Canada in 1962. His poetic works include Dainty Monsters, Rare Jelly, The Cinnamon Peeler. His style is surreal, chaotic, and dynamic, and he has a sense of the other, which often leads to a poetry of vivid gestures. Ondaatje also, like Atwood, has been a model and an inspiration for the development of the new surrealistic method in Canadian poetry. One difference is that whereas the women novelist sticks to a monotone to underline a bizarre shift in image, Ondaatje brings together a shifting voice and unpredictable juxtapositions. His well known hybrid work, the collection were collected works of Billy the Kid. The poem has seven paragraphs, and this is a poem called as Letters and Other Worlds. What roughly constitutes the first half of the poem: my father's body was a globe of fear. His body was a town we never knew. He hid that he had been where we were going. His letters were a room he seldom lived in. In them, the logic of his love could grow. My father's body was a town of fear. He was the only witness to its fear dance. He hid where he had been that might that we might lose him. And his letters were a room to his body, scared. He came to death with his mind drowning. On the last day, he enclosed himself. in a room with two bottles of gin, later fell the length of his body so that brain blood moved to new compartments that never knew the wash of fluid, and he died in minutes of a new equilibrium. His early life was a terrifying comedy, and my mother divorced him again and again. He would rush into tunnels magnetized by the white eye of trains, and once gaining instant fame, managed to stop a Ferrari in Ceylon. The whole possession of Elements dancer, local dignitaries by falling dead drunk onto the street as a semi-official and a semi-white at that, the act was seen as a crucial turning point in the whole rule movement. My mother had done her share too, her driving so bad she was stoned by villagers whenever her car was recognized. Now, this poem is written by Michael Ondachwe, and uh, it is the same poet who won the Booker Prize in 1992. Now, this poem is a kind of an elegy for the poet's father. Um, in the first few lines, the poet sees his father's body metaphorically as a town of fear and as a town that his family never knew. His letters are seen metaphorically as a room he seldom lived in. In the letters, the logic of his love could grow. His letters figuratively were room his body scared. Now, in this particular uh, poem, Michael Ondaatje deals with how people remember their pasts, particularly in the context of personal loss and sometimes fragmented, sometimes unreliable. There is a kind of a memory and that of trauma that shows how people are actually carrying emotional and physical wounds that shape their journey. The collective impact of Atwood and on Dutch Way as poets, if we consider this part, the two novelist poets just discussed have put Canada on the world map in poetry as well as fiction. Both use a number of modernist and postmodernist elements in their poems. The imagery is many times surrealistic and always arresting. On Dutch Way, as poet, is more a mixture of genres, and Atwood less so. On Dutchway's mastery of the long poem form is also quite striking. He is much more cinematic than Atwood. In the case of both, a lot of their personality comes into play in the poems. Both use considerable figurality also. All told, their overall impact has been quite impressive. The poetry books of both have won a number of prestigious awards. Often their novels are poetic in their use of language. In her poetry, Atwood continually startles the reader with her imagery, which unfolds in a terse, elliptical style. From the time of her first publication, Atwood has demonstrated remarkable artistic control of her poetic material. His book has a thematic unity and can be seen to elaborate a central preoccupation of her work, the role of mythology, both personal and cultural, in the individual life. She is fascinated by the conventions that lie behind everyday reality, by the mythological substructures of modern culture. Now, Margaret Wood's roles has been confused by the fame she has acquired in other fields as a novelist, as an innovatory critic of Canadian writing as a public personality. Her reputation in other fields of writing is not undeserved, but it has tended to obscure the excellence of her verse, read by a much smaller and largely a different audience from her fiction. Over the years since the Circle Game won the Governor General Award in 1966, her poetry has sustained an extraordinary level of sparse discipline. It is unobtrusively experimental in the manner of a poet, seeking always the appropriate form for the myth or the thoughts she is concerned with. This fastidious formalism is combined with a certain didacticism. The tough and the resilient phrasing combines with psychological realism and considerable visual sensibility to present. Atwood's poems are pervaded by a sense of mythic and historic unity with mankind, often unknown yet understood through a feeling. So, some of the important questions which you might note down for this particular unit is if you can comment on the collective contribution of Atwood and Ontache to recent Canadian poetry. Very important, these two novelists come or turned poets. Second one can be Atwood's use of a sibyl to talk about the speaker's own predicament, and what picture of Ontachwe father emerges from his poem Letters and Other Worlds. These are few of the important questions from this unit. So I think we can take a break of 10 minutes, and then we will be left with two more units. Unit 8, I think the last unit, yes, the last unit where we talk about five other important poets. So they are Earl Burnley, Al Purdy, Ellie Mandel, Thomas King, Dorothy Livesey, and then we discuss with the important questions, and then we can stop for the day. So please take a break of maximum 5 to 7 minutes so that we can finish it by 6. So it's 5:18 now. We can be here in the next 5 minutes. That is 5:23. Okay, so let's begin. So this is Unit 8, and before the break, we talked about the five other important poets that we are going to focus on, and we are going to focus on Earl Burnley, Al Purdy, Ellie Mandel, Thomas King, and Dorothy Livesey. And the poems are The Bear on the Delhi Road by Earl Burney, Elegy for a Grandfather by Al Purdy, Envoy by Ellie Mandel, Kyoto Sees the Prime Minister by Thomas King, and The Green Rain by Dorothy Livesey. Of these important poets, Thomas King is a native poet and Dorothy Livesey is a woman poet. So let's start first with Burney. Earl Burney was born in Alberta in 1904. He grew up in Calgary and on the farm in Erickson, British Columbia. His 1981 memoir Child Addict in Alberta tells of the influence of Calvinism and of his early infatuation with words. An honor student at the University of British Columbia, he went to a doctoral study in Old and Middle English at the University of Toronto, after which he taught at the University of Utah. So, David and Other Poems, written in 1942, and Near Falls Creek Mouth 1964, are two of his better known books of poetry. So, right now we are going to talk about The Bear on the Delhi Road. Give me a second, please. Yeah, okay. So the bear on the Delhi road has five uneven verse paragraphs. Now let's start first with the first verse. Unreal, tall as a myth, by the road, the Himalayan bear is beating the brilliant air with his crude arms. About him, two men bear, spindly as locusts sleep. Now, in this particular stanza, we see Bernice talking about a Himalayan bear on a Delhi road. He is unreal, that is, he's away from his natural habitat. He is very tall. Two bare, thin men accompany him on the road, and he beats the air with his crooked arms. The rest of the poem: one pulls on a ring in a great soft nose. His mate flicks with a stick up at the rolling eyes. They have not led him here down from the fabulous hills to this bald alien plain and the clamorous world to kill, but simply to teach him to dance. They are peaceful both, these pair men of Kashmir and the bear, alive is their living too. If far on the Delhi way, around him galvanic they dance, it is merely to wear from his shaggy body the tranced wishing forever to stay. Only an ambling bear, 4 footed in berries. It is no more joys for them in this hot dust to prance. out of reach of the preying claws, sharpened to paw for ants. In the shadows of deodars is not easy to free myth from reality or rear this fellow up to lurch with them in the tranced dancing of them. Now, this is the poem which is full with a vivid imagery and exploration of human and natural relationship. So, the bear in the poem, it symbolizes nature being tamed or controlled by humans. Its captivity evokes sympathy and it highlights the unnatural power dynamic between the humans and wild animals. The second verse paragraph talks about two men. The first pulls on a ring in the soft great nose of the bear. The second one, his companion, flicks with a stick up at the rolling eyes of the bear. Now, the poem is set on a busy road in Delhi, where onlookers are watching this. The setting is actually symbolizing the objectification of animals, how the situation where two of the men are trying to control the bear. There is a tension between the nature and civilization. So this is a clash between the untamed world and the human need to control and civilize it. The third verse paragraph, we are told that the purpose of these two men is to teach the bear to dance. That is why they have led him here, down from the fabulous Himalayan hills to the bald alien plain and the clamorous world of Delhi. They do not want to kill him but to help them earn their living. This is what happens when you try to tame the untamed, who is actually best fit to a different kind of natural world, but you are trying to bring him back into the busy streets of Delhi for for your own employment and to earn your living. So there is not only a broader implication of subjugation but also a loss of freedom here, that we see how the bear is losing its freedom, taken away from his natural habitat and then pushed along to a place where he does not really belong to. In the fourth verse paragraph, we are told that both these men from Kashmir are peaceful. All they want is a living. They want the bear to stay alive. They dance around him on Delhi road. They want to wear out from his shaggy body the wish to stay forever on four legs amidst berries. They want him to be like them on two legs and dance. This is indeed the kind of uh, um, um, non expectancy that a human would want from an animal, that they want the animal to be on their two legs and dance. And that's the reason why, although these people from Kashmir, two men from Kashmir, are actually understood as peaceful, they don't want to kill the bear, of course, because they would lose their employment in that way. But look what they're trying to make the bear do. So there's a contrast here between the bear's natural strength and how it is a subdued state. How there is a subdued state here. This is where the emotional impact of the poem. That is what the poet wants to to speak about. In the fifth verse paragraphs, we are told that what they are doing does not give them much joy. They are also away from Kashmir's cool air in the hot dust of Delhi. Now, here there is a point where both the people who actually belong to their own heritage or a place, they're not there. Instead, both of them are from different backgrounds and in a different place. Neither the bear likes the place nor the two people, those who are here to find a employment based on the bear. So both of them are on not in their natural heritage. And then in the last, towards the end, we understand that the two men who are trying to control the bear are also not liking what they're doing. So they're not in the joy, they're not enjoying what they're doing. So this evokes both a kind of deep empathy and a strong reflection on broader issues. So what or who might have asked these two men to bring a bear to the streets of Delhi and make him go stand in two legs and like humans and dance? Definitely they are also under a big a group or a person that has asked him or asked them to do so. So we see both the bear and the two men, they are on issues of exploitation of power. How they're not allowing the natural way of living in a way. So this is hinting at the broader implications of subjugation and loss of freedom. So the treatment of humans towards animals versus the treatment of humans towards humans, almost both of them are in the similar situation. The only thing is the humans can add a bit to their mind, but definitely the bear is here very, yeah, in an impossible manner. The bear is not able to save himself in some way or the other. So that is what the imagery and the style of Bernie here, the use of vivid and stark imagery that he uses. And the poem is written in free verse. So that is one of the most essential poem of its kind that Bernie has written. So it's a must read. What are your views regarding the poem? What are your views regarding the poem? How would you take the poem to be? Do you find that really these two men who are trying to make their living doing good to the bear? Do you think like that? Yeah, what are your views? Okay, no problem. We'll move to the next poet, and that is Al Purdy. Al Purdy was born as Wooler, Ontario, hamlet near Lake Ontario in 1918. His father, a farmer of United Empire Loyalist stock, died when Purdy was two. Now, he has also served in the Royal Canadian Air Force from 1940 to 1944. His important works are The Caribou Horses, Collected Poems of Alpurdi, Women on the Shore, The New Romans, and many more. Now, today we are going to study of Alpurdi, the important poem that he has written, An Elegy for a Grandfather. Alpurdi's poem Elegy for a Grandfather consists of four verse paragraphs of uneven length. The first verse paragraph reads like this: well, he died, I guess. They said he did. His wide, well born hips will make a prehistoric barrow. Men of the future may find and perhaps may not, where this man's relatives duck their heads in real and pretended sorrow. For the dearly beloved gone, thank Christ to God. After a bad century, a tough, big bellied pharaoh with a deck of cards in his pocket and a Presbyterian green. So, in this particular stanza, Purdy uses some figures of speech to characterize his dead grandfather and also gives his reaction to the real or pretended sorrow by his relatives. The grandfather was a big man and had wide hips. He had a big belly and was like a character called Pharaoh. He had a Presbyterian grin and carried a deck of cards in his pocket. The second verse: maybe he did die, but the boy didn't understand it. The man knows now, and the scandal never grows old, of a happy lumberjack who lived in on rotten whiskey and died of sin and Quaker oats aged 90 or so. But all he was too much for any man to be, a life so full he wouldn't include one more thing, nor tell the same story twice if he would wanted to, and didn't. Now, in the second verse, Purdy states that all that his grandfather was too much for a man to be with. His life was too full and eventful. The scandal about him was that he lived on rotten whiskey and died on Quaker oats at the age of 90 or so. The next verse, just the same, he's dead. A sticky religious voice folded his century sideways to get it out of sight and lowered him into the ground like someone still alive who made other people uncomfortable. Now, in the third verse, Purdy talks about the church service done by the priest. He says that his grandfather was a barn raiser and a backward farmer. He lived in his old life in one room apartment over a store. The earth takes him as it takes more beautiful things. Among such things, Purdy enumerates populations of whole countries, museums, and work of art, beautiful women. Now, if you carefully dig into the poem, you'll come to know that Purdy has an ability to blend personal experiences with universal themes, often capturing the rugged landscapes and complexities of human relationships. Now, you will find in the poem Elegy for a Grandfather, there is a mortality theme and of a theme of death. The poem centers on the death of the speaker's grandfather here, that explores the emotional aftermath of losing a family member. But then what happens is, because there is a connection between generations, how each generation learns from the one before it. The grandfather's life here represents a bridge between the past traditions and the present, highlighting both continuity and change over time. So there are people who would come to who are really sorrowful about the incident, and there are people who would be pretending. Perhaps like they were waiting for his death. It so happens. So that's how Purdy has the ability to write down his personal experiences connected with the universal themes. So, body style here, if you talk about, it's both personal and direct. He often draws from the rural Canadian life in his poetry, and there are glimpses of simplicity, hard-working life that his grandfather likely led. He had a full life, he had an eventful life. So, this adds a layer of respect and admiration for the grounded traditional values that the grandfather represented. We next come to Elie Mandel. Elie Mandel was born in Estevan, 1922. His father was a Russian Jewish immigrant, and his major works are Dreaming Backwards, Another Time, and The Family Romance. He has written Envoy. Envoy is a kind of a poem which starts with My country is not a country. It starts with the line, My country is not the country, but winter rivers of ice from St. Hubert, terrible knives run through the whiteness of my veins. Politics pierce my heart on a floor littered with history. I shiver while wardens shovel in lunatic sentences, rag upon rag. It must be cold in prison in Quebec, and your heart, hurt singer, what do you see through its pain? I see slaves circle the river, Montreal tense against the steel of its manacles, your words drifting like frozen wounds, blessing. A sick bride, a murderous bridegroom, that wedding whose children will be colder killers than the words of this or any other song. The title envoy is a French word which means to dispatch. The poet here says that the country is not a country but winter rivers of ice. Though the whiteness of his veins run terrible knives from Saint Hubert. The poet says that politics pierce his heart on a floor littered with history. He says that he shivers while wardens shovel in lunatic sentences, rag upon rag. He says of Quebec that there must be cold in prison. Now, here, Envoy is a reflective poem by Elie Mandel that touches on themes of memory, departure, and the passage of time. Elie Mandel is a Canadian poet, as we all know, and he is talking about the departure and farewell in this poem. Who It's a kind of a poetic form that he has mentioned, a very short stanza at the end of the poem, often which convey a farewell or a parting message. This poem suggests the thematic focus on closure or endings or transition or possibly emotional or intellectual. He also talks about the coldness and the cold-blooded quality which has seeped into Canadian life. Now, Mandel's poem here captures the fleeting nature of life and experience, the sense of parting or closure that is integrated in his Jewish heritage. It reflects about the multiple interpretations based on the reader's perspective. This poem can lend a feeling of quiet resignation or acceptance. So the poet reflects his deep engagement with memory, history, and the complexities of concluding something significant. Then we come to the next poet, who's called as the Thomas King. Thomas King was born on 24th April uh, in Canada. His main novels are Medicine River and Green Grass, Running Water. He has also book of stories. He has edited anthology, and right now we are talking about the poem by Thomas King. Kyoto sees the Prime Minister. Um One of Thomas King's most famous poems is Kyoto sees the Prime Minister. It is a short poem. Now, the lines read like this. Coyote went east to see the Prime Minister. I wouldn't make this up. And the Prime Minister was so happy to see Coyote that he made him a member of cabinet. Maybe you can help us solve the Indian problem. Sure, says that Coyote. What's the problem? When Elwood tells his story, he always laughs and spoils the ending. Now, uh, this particular uh, poem is one of the remarkable poems to come from Canada. It has layerings of irony, and the irony is devastating. But first, we need to know a little bit about this coyote. Coyote is a trickster figure in Canadian oral literature. The whole history of exploitation and extermination of natives gets telescoped here. What is also attacked is the white tendency to treat everything in terms of solutions and problems. It is a grim story whose ending gets spoiled by Elwood's laughing when telling the story. The problem has been solved, so what's the problem here? Typography is very important. When King wants to put extra emphasis on a word, he emphasizes it. That's the reason why he has capitalized words like happy, help, what, loves. This typographical device foregrounds to the INI deployed by King. This INI is strongly reinforced by references to making things up, to telling a story, and to spoiling an ending. The core of the king's poem is quite is saying, "Sure, what's the problem?" in response to the Prime Minister's statement, "Maybe you can help us with the Indian problem." The irony is in maybe as well as the approach that it is always solving problems of various kinds. So, this was what it was with the poem. Quite to see is the Prime Minister. The next poet is Dorothy Livesey. This would be the last poet, and Dorothy Livesey was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba. She was educated at Glenmar Private School for Girls and with interruptions at the University of Toronto and the Sorbonne. Her important works are Green Pictures, Signpost Day and Nights, Poems for People, The Unique Bed, Paint Songs, among many others. So, right now we are going to study the poem The Green Rain. The poet The Green Rain reads like this: I remember long veils of green rain, feathered like shawl of my grandmother, green from the half green of the spring trees, waving in the valley. I remember the road like the one which leads to my grandmother's house, a warm house which with green carpets, geraniums, a thrilling canary, and shining horsehair chairs. I remember on that day I was thinking only of my love and of my love's house, but now I remember the day as I remembered my grandmother. Now, in this poem, it's talking about memory and remembering the memories of rain and of the speaker's beloved one. There is also a memory of her grandmother. She remembers the grandmother's shawl, her house, and the parlor in that house. The rain is remembered as the feathery fringe of her shawl. In the poem, there are three verse paragraphs. The first one talks the veils of green rain. The analogy is established between those veils and the shawl of the speaker's grandmother. Rain is green from the half green of the spring trees here, waving in the valley. The second verse paragraph talks of the road which she remembers. This is like the road that led to her grandmother's house. Details of the house are then given. It is a warm house with green carpets. There is a geranium, a singing canary, and a shining chair. There is silence. What fills the silence is the rains falling. Her grandmother parlor was alive with herself and her rising and falling voice. And in the last paragraph, the speaker brings in her the love and his house. So, in this poem, the poet talks about how she remembers every and other day that she thinks about her grandmother. She recalls everything from her past, especially when she is thinking about her only love and the house that probably she had been to. Now she remembers the day as she remembers her grandmother. The sum total is that she remembers the rain as a feathery soft fringe of her grandmother's shawl. So this is about today's uh, MEG-12 recent Canadian poetry. We discussed about the five poems by five representative poets, and some important questions which you need to focus on is the Burmese react on the sight of a bear on a Delhi road, the tone of Purdy's tribute to his grandfather, the Canada's weather by Mandel Stress in Envoy, Thomas King's deploying Aini in Coyote, she is the Prime Minister, and Dorothy Livesey is the Green Rain, mainly about. So this is with this we finish with MEG-12 recent Canadian poetry. This is block 2. So tomorrow we meet again with no, not tomorrow, or we meet directly on Monday as per the timetable. Yeah, we meet on 17th. We meet on 17th, uh, 4 to 6 again. 17th. So 14th, 15th, 16th is a holiday. We meet on 17th. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.